My guest today is Agnès Bénassy. Agnès is the chief economist of the French Treasury and has substantially contributed to France Relance, France's economic reconstruction plan. Previously, she was a professor of economics at the Paris School of Economics, where she focused on monetary systems, exchange rates, and European integration.
Agnès, thanks very, very much for being here. This is really great to have you and have your views on how things are moving along in France. What is your sense about why did France suddenly have this fast growth, and how is France attempting to stop the virus? The confinement is not the usual confinement; it's something different. Tell us a little bit about the health background before we get into the economics.
The health background.
Yeah, the pandemic and the lockdown. How is it going now?
So we are now in the middle of our second lockdown. So first of all, thanks for the invitation. I'm very happy and to participate in this fantastic series of webinars. So we are now in the middle of our second lockdown. During the first lockdown actually was very strict. It started in mid-March and ended in mid-May, so 2 months. And activity was very, very damaged. So activity was running around minus 30% compared to normal. So this second lockdown is different in several ways. First, schools remain open, public services are open, people are around to go to work, although telework is strongly recommended. And but still, shops are closed, and actually they are very unhappy about that. And of course, restaurants and bars and discos and so on. So we still don't have a good image of what's happening with respect to economic activity. The first survey by the Banque de France is saying that activity is running something like minus 12% compared to normal. We'll have more information because this first survey was done at the very beginning of the second lockdown, and it was still vacation. So we are not so sure what's going to happen, but for sure the impact will be much milder than for the first lockdown.
So one new thing that you put in this second lockdown in place have been measures to directly support small businesses, entrepreneurs with direct payments. How is that program working? How does it work, and how do you see it working out?
Okay, so we have the experience of the first lockdown. There was a lot of support to the businesses. The first one was short-time work, like in other countries. Second one was what we called a solidarity fund for small businesses. They can get a lump sum depending on whether they also those who were closed, but on the top of that, those who are suppliers of those who are closed that are experiencing very sharp drops in their turnover. And so they could ask for lump sum amount. And then we had also tax holidays, tax deferrals, and also tax cuts in some sectors. And on top of that, guaranteed loans, which were a big success. So this first wave was quite a success in the sense that so we are now seeing that corporate defaults are much lower than last year, minus 30% or even minus 50%, depending on the measure. So part of it is due to the lockdown itself and to also special treatment given during this period, but we are not seeing a catching up. And also we can see that the measures were successful in the recovery. So after the lockdown, the recovery was very fast. Consumption picked up very quickly, and also well, less, but also vigorously GDP. And so just before the second lockdown, the economy was running something like minus 4% compared to normal. So over the year, we are expecting a very sharp drop in GDP, something like -10 or even -11%.
So the fear that many of us have is that as things get longer and closures accumulate, that we see companies' balance sheets really sharply deteriorating, and we start to see a wave of failure. So you said, well, up to now, what we have seen is a relatively benign scenario in terms of failures. Do you fear that the companies are getting to the end of their liquidity and of their ability to sustain themselves? And it's not just a liquidity problem, but it becomes also a solvency problem with so many months of low income. What's your sense about their balance sheets, the corporate, and particularly for the small business?
So far at the aggregate level, small companies have borrowed worth 175 billion euros from the banks, and also from the so I think this is from the banks, and they have deposits, most of it, 174 billion in cash in the banks. So
wow.
So far,
it's a shocking statistic.
The guaranteed loans have been used as insurance. Probably part of this money will be used. Probably there is heterogeneity between the different firms. Some are lacking cash, some have too much cash, but on the whole, we don't see so far a big wave, not in the coming months. Then insolvency is something else. So we have run micro simulations for 2 million SMEs, and taking their balance sheets in 2017. Actually, we are redoing the same with 2018 balance sheets, but we didn't have them at that time. So this represents 91% of private value added in France. And we have shocked the balance sheets with sector-specific shocks. So this corresponds to the first lockdown. We are redoing it for the second one, but we don't have the results yet. So we have shocked with sector-specific shocks. So, for instance, restaurants most hardly hit, etc. We have introduced the government support schemes. Short-time work, solidarity fund, the tax deferrals, the guarantees loan. So we have an analysis in terms of liquidity and an analysis in terms of insolvency. And the assumption that is made is that once the cash that was already in the balance sheet is used, then the firm starts to borrow, and this is where it accumulates a debt and possibly a debt overhang. And what we find at the end, on the top of that, we consider a firm in need of cash, in need of equity, when the assets, the total assets, go below 1.1 times the debt. So it's not just bankruptcy; it's a little more than bankruptcy, with a kind of buffer of 10%. So we want the firms to be to have assets at least 10% above the level of debt. And the result was at the time that the need for equity was something like between 15 billion and 20 billion.
So not dramatic.
So really. It's not dramatic, and other people have run similar simulations with different assumptions, of course, and sometimes they don't cover all the support schemes, but the orders of magnitude are similar. We expect bankruptcies, of course, to increase in 21, mainly in 21, but something like 20 to 25% above the numbers in 19. And so it would go from 50,000 to something like 60 or 65,000 per year. And these numbers have already been seen after the previous crisis, actually. These were the numbers in the first half of 2010s.
So it's actually, I would say, pretty miraculous if you manage to have a 12% drop in GDP or 11% in 1 year and only see that kind of increase in bankruptcy. I mean, it would talk very well of the schemes and of the support that has been given to the economy, I think. So
Well,
coming from...
just on this, so the shock on the French economy was something like 11% or 12%, depending on what you think will be the final numbers. And we expect the government to absorb 63% of the shock. So there would be only 23% left to the corporate sector, which is worth 60 billion euros. So it's a very large number, but simultaneously, the households have accumulated savings worth 100 billion, just to give a comparison.
Very, very interesting. And I must say, the paper that you described doing that massive simulation seems really, really interesting. I don't know if it's already available, but
there is a blog post by myself.
Okay. I will link it in the.
We want to publish, yes, some working papers, but the problem we have is that we have to redo the simulations each time.
And the second way.
Yeah.
Very good. So, but still, I mean, it sounds really, really fascinating exercise. So liquidity seems not to be a problem. Solvency seems to be a manageable problem. And now the question is really, to some extent, hopefully, the recovery. So the recovery, which is basically getting that V shape that we already saw in the summer, and getting the economy to grow, even though it has accumulated this debt overhang. We have some good news from the vaccines. I don't know what's your judgment. I don't know if you have any insights from the economic perspective. It seems like we will see big numbers of vaccinations by Q1, and we seem to be. It's possible that we will recover by the end of Q2 some semblance of normalcy. Is that your sense from what you're reading?
Well, we are listening to various views about the vaccines. Our main scenario is that over the first semester, we will still have restrictions. We don't know which kind of restrictions, but there will still be some restrictions. So the economy will not recover the normal path. And so we see vaccination to really start for the second semester. And this is where the economy can pick up very strongly. So this is our main scenario. Maybe there will be a third wave. You never know. So we don't factor a third wave so far, but still some restrictions, and there are different views about the extent of such restrictions. Mm-hmm. What we know is that the sectors that are directly impacted by this crisis represent something like 9% of GDP. Mm-hmm. So this is a drag on the economy. So you can see a recovery of the other sectors, as we've seen in June and July. But these 9% will weigh on the economy for a long time. If you think about international tourism, which although tourism is a lower share than in Spain, it's still quite high. And it also brings together other sectors like transportation, international aviation, or other sectors. So also retail. I think retail is going to suffer very much. Already before the crisis, the textile retail was not doing well, and there may be a structural change. Maybe consumers are less interested in
fast fashion, throwing things away.
I don't know, but it was already, and as a general view, so we see an acceleration of pre-existing trends.
Yeah.
Also, for the shops, we've seen that shops that were digitalized fared much better than the other ones during the first lockdown. It's really impressive. The gap between those that were digitalized and those which were not is about 25 percentage points in terms of turnover drop. So it's really this could be an accelerator of digitalization. The government is giving funds to the shops to help them catching up, and we know that this was a weakness of the French economy prior to the crisis. Now shops are understanding that it's a key element of resilience. So the hope is that this will well, we are looking for good outcomes of this crisis. This may be one.
So this is it leads me exactly where I wanted to go, which is the recovery plan that the French government put in place, starting with the launch in September for 100 billion, 4% of GDP, and much larger than the ones during the financial crisis. One question, a small question about the plan, then we talk about the bigger design, but very related to what you're talking about, is how do you get small firms to understand that digitalization is an opportunity to make business plans, to take this money and this action? Small and medium enterprises normally don't even think of this as part of their, it's not in their radar. How is the French government trying to get these recovery efforts, of which we will talk in a minute, to these players that you were just mentioning?
Okay, so for the shops, it's pretty evident now, especially since it's the second time. So the click and collect, so they see the other ones. There's a lot of, you see the neighbor and doing things you can do also. So there is a lot of this, and in the plan there are funds to help SMEs. Actually, the government is going to advertise a lot about the help they can get, and the first actions seem to be quite successful. There was a call for tender so it's more towards the public sector, but also towards the SMEs. So there was a first call of tenders for industrial projects, and a huge response. So they responded very much. So it doesn't mean that the projects are good and they're going to be accepted, but there seems to be a taste for investments. So this is good. And the recovery plan, so the strategy of the recovery plan is to have different pockets of money and to reallocate the pockets in case one doesn't work. So this is why the money is not delegated. The budgets are not delegated to the ministers, to the ministries. They are managed from, you would say, the center, although it's collaboration with the local administrations, but not through specialized ministries like housing or energy transition also. So this allows a reallocation of the budget just in case they don't deliver.
Mm-hmm. That's excellent, and that's the opposite of what the Spanish plan. The European money is basically being distributed to all the ministries to spend. So that's not really likely to work, I'm afraid. So I think that what you're suggesting seems more reasonable. Have you basically imposed the same priorities that Europe is going to use in its recovery plan in terms of digitalization and climate, or is there a broader set of industrial policies that are acceptable in this plan?
So the plan is a thick one. There are many chapters, but a third of the plan is the greening the economy. And this is maybe why somewhere we need to really think about, because if you have different objectives, only one instrument is going to be very tough. So there is one objective of short-term recovery, because we know the faster we come back to normal, the less scars to the economy. Second is to lift the GDP level and growth. GDP level, because this is key for employment and also tax resources. And growth, we know that we have a slowdown of productivity growth, maybe a secular slowdown. And finally, we want a different growth. So we have basically three objectives. And this is why budget. So this is why we have different aspects of the recovery plan for the different objectives. And what was done to construct this plan was to look at the pre-existing diagnosis of the French economy. And what was the pre-existing diagnosis? There was quite a good recovery pre-crisis. So it's always when you get sick, it's good beforehand to be in good health. So this is something you can experiment. So before the crisis, unemployment was declining at a steady rate, but there was persistent trade deficit. There was a productivity slowdown, so it's in all advanced economies, but some specific features in France were low digitalization of SMEs, was a skill mismatch. So many firms looking for labor and didn't find. And also insufficient innovation performance and also production taxes. So some labor market reforms had been enacted, and I think they would be helpful to help the reallocation of labor. So there were very two systemic reforms of the training, one for apprenticeship and another one for adults. I think this is going to be very useful, and also purchasing power had been increased through different measures. You remember the Gilets jaunes, and after the Gilets jaunes, there were a number of transfers that were increased, and also the personal income tax was cut. So this was before the Gilets jaunes, but nevertheless. And so a number of tax and transfer measures in favor of purchasing power. And finally, the green agenda was blocked, as you know, because the increase in the carbon tax was put to a halt. So then comes the crisis, and our diagnosis about, so you need to increase aggregate demand in the short term. So aggregate demand is first of all consumption, household consumption, and obviously not constrained by too high interest rates, and it's not constrained by on aggregate by purchasing power. Over 2020, the gross disposable income of households is going to stay stable compared to 2019, the same number.
Who could have imagined that could happen? I mean, it's really extraordinary.
Yeah. So there's a little bit of inflation.
Could have such a growth, such a drop in GDP and maintain disposable income.
So there are some inequalities which need to be sorted out, but on aggregate, there's no problem of disposable income, and there's 0.5% of inflation, so a very small decrease in purchasing power. Then, so our view is that consumption is mostly constrained by uncertainties. So uncertainties on the health, which is something we cannot fix, unfortunately, and uncertainty in the labor market. We know that the savings rate is very closely related to the unemployment rate, hence the insistence of the recovery plan on the labor market. We have thought about, when we saw the Germans cut the VAT for a limited amount of time, we thought about it. But we thought, so first, the experience of France with VAT cuts is not good, with low pass-through. Second, it's very costly. And third, when you have a crisis where you don't know the end point, you don't know when it will end, it's a bit awkward to say we will stop, say, in December, and then what happens in January? You have a hole in consumption, and maybe the crisis will not be ended. So we didn't go in that direction. But France is different from Germany. Germany has a lack of aggregate demand, whereas in France, you never had. And it's also interesting to compare the two countries in terms of public investment and so on. In France, we know how to spend the money. It's whereas in Germany, sometimes they hesitate and they no longer know how to do it. So this is a strength. So the second problem is private investment. Private investment also, of course, is constrained by uncertainty. In terms of markups, so there is a drop in markups in 2020, but we expect the support or the government support in 2021 will help firms to recover on aggregate the pre-crisis markup. So this should trigger some investment, especially if there is some equity or equity-like injection. So our view of private investment is that the pre-crisis drugs are still there. So it's competitiveness, skills, innovation, production taxes. Hence the cut in production taxes and the ambitious plans in terms of skills, which is quite difficult. But there is a lot of money directed to skill building. And finally, we have the public investment. And also have investment by households, where there will be subsidization of the renovation of the houses. And public investment, unfortunately, this is an election year at local level. 70% of public investment is carried out at local level. And we know with the election cycle that just after the election, you have a drop in investment. Hence, a lot of money is directed to these local. So you have money to renovate the schools and so on. So the package is really investment-driven, an investment-driven stimulus package, and directed to physical capital, human capital, and also a green transformation. So the idea was also to use this opportunity to kickstart kind of dynamics in terms of greening the economy, although alone 100 billion is much too small to make a huge change in terms of carbon emissions. But what we hope is that it will be enough to trigger some skill building, some supply, to organize the supply of these services, and hopefully later on at the European level, we will have a very ambitious policy, especially in terms of carbon pricing.
So this was really a very good and very complete diagnosis and treatment. There are two things on which I was not clear and which are particularly interesting to me. One is skill mismatches and working on the skills and improving skills, digitalizing in particular. And the second is what you said about equity support, equity injections. Let's start from the first. We know both for Spain, for France, for Italy, it's always a permanent problem, this skill mismatch and getting people ready for the work of the future, not trained for the past. How is this being tackled right now with these new plans and these new tools?
Okay, so for the youth, there was a reform before the crisis of apprenticeship. And the idea was to create a kind of market for apprenticeship where the grant is given to the student, not to the school. So the student will come with the grant to a school, and only schools with students will be funded in that way. So it's a way to reallocate the supply side more smoothly, because it's very rigid otherwise.
Wonderful.
And the take-up, we are very worried about the take-up in September. And it seems that the numbers are about the same as last year. So last year it was a good year. They have diminished a little bit, but mostly stable. So this is a good news because it was not easy to, well, there have been some subsidization, and it's basically free to have an apprenticeship of the first year. The second reform was for the training of the adults, and this is much more difficult in a sense. So there was also a reform. The reform was to disintermediate the training system. So if you want to change to no longer be a professor of economics, neither a member of parliament, you can go on your an app on your smartphone, and you will get, you type you want to be a nurse, or you want to be whatever, and they will propose some training, and you can go directly, have the information and get also bonuses. So you accumulate an account in euros. You can spend freely on some training. So you want to learn German, and you can buy training in German. And for some programs, you get a bonus from the region or from the professional organization. So the reform was enacted before the crisis, was not really deployed when the crisis hit. So they are presently finalizing this reform so that it could be instrumental for the reallocation. So far, I don't have the numbers. I cannot say whether it works or not, but this is the idea. So you can go to the job agency and be accompanied, but you can also do it yourself. This is
it sounds quite fantastic, actually. I mean, both ideas of having people choose and the money goes with the student and not the school, and having the ability to build your own trajectory, particularly for older people, seems fantastic use of technology. And I mean, we've defended things like that in Spain, but it doesn't seem like to happen. So maybe Spain always does what France does. So maybe there is now some hope. Sorry.
But then it's a challenge is to get these schemes known, because most people have no idea about it, and it's really difficult to disseminate information and to simplify, because of course in the system some people want to keep it quite opaque. So you really need to work hard to have the system simplified and disseminated.
Understood. So there was a second question I wanted to pose on the list you made before, which concerned equity injections. So the point of these equity injections is that there are at least two difficulties that I see with them. The first is, what form should they take, particularly for small and medium-sized enterprises? There was a form of equity injection that Olivier Blanchard was suggesting to help small and medium-sized enterprises, which was that there was an automatic debt restructuring that the state would take that would be complementary with the restructurings that would be accepted by banks. That's one possibility. But there are many other possibilities. The problem is that those companies are not in the stock market. So injecting equity and then getting out is always a hard thing. The second difficulty is politics, particularly for big companies. If we have the state going around giving money, then how are we going to be sure that they don't give money to their friends or to favor projects? How are these equity injections structured to avoid these problems?
Okay, so the way we're taking this problem is the following. For very small firms, we don't think that equity injections are an issue, because you don't see equity injection into a small restaurant. It doesn't make sense. So it will still be grants. So these kind of very, very small firms already get grants. There are sector programs, sector-specific programs that will get grants to survive. For mid-caps, there's already a system for the restructuring. So for those firms with more than 400 employees, they can ask to a specific public body, which represents all the public creditors of the firm. So this is what is nice. And so this public creditor will liaise with the private creditors and organize the restructuring. So they exist already. So these are not big numbers, a few tens of firms in normal times, maybe more in next year, but it will remain limited for larger firms. For smaller but still relatively large firms, there's an equivalent at the local level. So there is kind of already some organized restructuring scheme for firms of a certain size. So the question is in between the 2 million I was talking about at the beginning of the interview. And here the idea is to propose quasi-equity. So the government is not going to be a shareholder of 2 million firms. This is good news. And like Spain, France is a country where most of the funding to the SMEs goes through the banks. So there is a network of banks, and we are going to rely on this network. So the banks have already distributed the guaranteed loans. These loans need to be repaid. They can be restructured over a longer period, but eventually they will be repaid. So the idea is to distribute quasi-equity, which are junior loans that will be repaid depending on certain circumstances. So the cost is a bit higher, but it's much more flexible for the firms. And so the banks will distribute these quasi-equity, these junior loans. They will keep 10% of the risk in their balance sheet to have an incentive to make the selection. They will also use, so I don't know whether it exists in Spain, maybe yes. There is a rating of all SMEs by the Banque de France. So these products will be limited to relatively well-rated companies prior to the crisis. So they want to support viable firms because you still need to have some renewal of the business of the corporate sector. So the firms will keep 10%, and then the rest will be transferred to some funds. So there can be one or several investment funds with private investors and with a partial guarantee from the government. The details are still not known because it's kind of equation with many constraints. You need to have a product that is not too costly for the firms, otherwise they will not take it, or even worse, there could be some adverse selection. The bank need to have an incentive to distribute this product. The funds, the private investors need to come, so there needs to be some return. And the government needs to not take too much risk and to comply with European rules in terms of state aid. So there are a number of constraints. Probably there is a solution, and we are still working on the solution.
I was just working on European legislation to make this kind of securitization more simple. We just got a deal on the package, and we're going to negotiate with the government. So I hope that helps. So I wanted to move to the European level with a couple of questions. The first one is, do you think what Europe has done with the recovery plan, with the ESM, and with all the other mechanisms that were put in place between in the second quarter of last year, which we're now finally passing on the parliament, including the new 7-year package, the budget, extraordinary, the facility, the recovery and resilience facility. Do you think these measures are going to be sufficient? Do you think the recovery plan at 750 billion is going to be sufficient? Are we going to have to put in place a second European package or a third, depending how you count? What is your view on that?
So the response to this question is very difficult at this stage because it's a very general question, in fact. Because borrowing costs in the different European countries are very close to each other and close to what the next generation EU will get. So it's much more a question of whether you want a little more of national debt or a little more of European debt. So my view and my previous work tends to suggest that one weakness we have in Europe is to have too much of national debt and too little of European debt, which makes the EU area so different from the US. But then if the European debt needs to be repaid through national contributions, it's a little bit of the same. So I think the key question is rather the own resource question. if we manage in finding a new resource to service this common debt, then it's a complete game changer, because the service of this debt will not be at the expense of the service of the national debt. Whereas if it's more European debt, but in fact there's a compartment for each country and they have to service their compartment, it's a little bit of the same. So this would be my response to that. It's yes, it's a kind of balance between two types of debts.
Yes, I think that's quite right, and the European Parliament has been indeed pushing for those own resources, and we're hoping that they will be issued over the next couple of years. I hope that will be the case. We have a calendar and we have a commitment. A second European question, Agnès, is the fiscal rules. You've been following that debate quite closely, and you know that the rules have been weakened now, and well, in fact, they have been suspended. And there is a huge debate now in Europe that starting, and that is going to become bigger and bigger over the next few months, which is, what do we do with the fiscal framework that we had made? I think there was a saying in Brussels that there was one civil servant that understood the fiscal rules, but he died. So nobody understands the whole Stability and Growth Pact, six-pack, two-pack, and all the rest. How should Europe go back to stability? And if you think that there should be a reform of the fiscal rules, what kind of reforms would you favor?
So you're right to say that we are today living under the protective general escape clause. But nevertheless, before the crisis, there were a lot of debate going on, with some convergence between academic papers, with the European Fiscal Board, with the IMF, OECD. So they were recommended something like a spending rule or debt rule, also a simplification of SGP. Now, recently, Olivier Blanchard and co-authors have come up with a more disruptive proposal, also to replace the rules altogether with some kind of standard, and with some stochastic analysis of the vulnerability of each country. So I'm presently finishing a paper, a Geneva report with Giancarlo Corsetti, Gabart, and Xavier Debrun on the policy mix. I think that so the report will argue that today we need to fully exploit the complementarity between fiscal and monetary policy. And in order to fully exploit this complementarity, you need each instrument to remain credible, to be anchored on something. So the ideas of merging the two, this is not the solution. To still have two independent instruments, but coordinated and with credibility. So in that spirit, I would say that fiscal rules are useful as a way of anchoring the expectation to have fiscal policy predictable for monetary policy, and probably monetary policy, and we know there is a review going on at the ECB, will also have to come up with maybe forward guidance plus, something that will be predictable for the governments. So if each other can anticipate credibly what the other one is going to do 3 years ahead, then it will be easier to have really a stimulation of both monetary and fiscal policy, but where we also see that this is temporarily and is credibly temporarily. So I would not throw away the fiscal rules. Probably they need to be revised, but some work needs to be done with a new context. And also, I would put forward the often forgotten MIP, the macroeconomic imbalance procedure, because what we want is aggregate demand, whether it comes from the private or the public sector. In a sense, doesn't matter for the macroeconomy. So we want high inflation, we want higher aggregate demand, and we know that the euro area has a surplus, so there's something needs to be fixed. So I would put forward also the MIP and I've written for the European Parliament on this twice, to put it at the same level as the SGP, which is a big difficulty.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think that there is a difficulty, and to some extent the difficulty is more political than economic, right? There is really I mean, very diverging views between different countries on how this process should be. There are also in the academic, apart from the view by Blanchard and Zedemeyer and co-authors that you mentioned on the stochastic sustainability analysis idea, there is also an idea that the Fiscal Stability Board has put on the table, which is more about just giving a predictable path for the expenditure, just an expenditure path, and not forget about the expenditure rule. The expenditure rule, in terms of the predictability that you're looking for, might be easier than the stochastic sustainability analysis, which seems to have a little bit potentially too much discretion. Do you feel it could work? What of the two would you prefer?
Well, the 7+7 report was arguing in favor of the expenditure rule. Now, I think there needs to be a specific thinking of the level of debt we want. I've not seen so far. I've not seen convincing research on what is the optimal level of debt, given the fact that the neutral at the global level, the neutral real interest rate is negative. So probably, if all countries could coordinate their debts to stay stable at a higher level, maybe this could be good for monetary policy to recover some leeway to react to the cycle. So but then the problem with very high level of debt is that of vulnerability. Because if you make a mistake at low level of debt, it's benign. If you make a mistake at a high level of debt, it's dramatic. So I think the two go together. So you need some vulnerability assessment if you have a high level of debt, whatever you think about the path of. It's two different things. You need to look at the variance and at the central path at the same time. Whereas if you are at lower level of debt, just the expectation is enough. You see what I mean? So I like the idea of some vulnerability analysis. I'm more skeptical about the stochastic analysis, because if we are in a world where we don't know the probability laws of the economy, we are in an economy with bifurcations, with some extreme events can happen. Then maybe it's better to do some stress testing, standard stress testing with some scenario which is conventional, and you look what happens in this event, and you have some contingency planning.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that might be the easier path indeed. Last issue is the bank situation moving forward in the banking union more broadly. So many of us, and you've also have views on this, are worried about the fact that the resolution is not really working, and particularly French banks are concerned. They say, well, look, we are paying a lot to have a resolution system that it looks like having a Rolls-Royce parked in the garage that's never driven ever. It's like, okay, the system is great, let's not touch it. So now we are facing a potential bank-in. I mean, if solvency continues being good as you expect, maybe not, but maybe in some countries we'll have financial crises more broadly than just some narrow specific banks or some narrow specific firms. If this were to happen, is your view that we have advanced sufficiently with banking union? Do we need a bad bank at the European level? So those are two different questions, but they are connected. What should be the European role if a banking crisis were to emerge as a consequence in the aftermath of the crisis?
So I have no definite answer to this question. Not really very strong personal view. There will probably be a lot of diversity in the outcomes with the problems of NPLs, like before the previous crisis, actually, being very different across countries. For France, we don't see a big danger with that. As I said, the numbers of bankruptcies should remain, be high, but remain within the range we have already seen in the past. And since the banks are better capitalized, we don't see really a danger there. However, I know that in other countries, it may be quite different. So at some point, maybe some bad bank scheme could be needed in some countries. Then what is very important is that it's done while abiding with the rules in terms of state aid and in terms of shareholder participation. So this is extremely important. It's even more important if a European scheme is to be introduced, because obviously, as you said, banks are paying a lot to the resolution fund and then don't want to pay a second time for some specific arrangements at local level. So this is very important. More generally, I think my country is very positive about the banking union, very pushy on the banking union, but with also the objective to so of course to weaken the doom loop, which is not easy today. And so this means that the taxpayer needs to be protected from future resolutions. And also there is very much stress on the cross-border, on the alleviating the obstacles to cross-border activity. Yes. So this, and this is consistent also with the capital market union and all the projects of the EU area. So, and progress is very slow in this area.
Well, thanks very, very much. We could talk for another hour. I have many more questions, but I have to let you go. Thanks very, very much for your time. It was really very interesting, and I really learned a lot. I hope everybody did. Thank you, Agnès.
Thanks for the invitation. It was a pleasure.
It was a pleasure. Bye.